Welcome everyone to another chapter of the fanfiction Home Finds Grian by Dragons Are Cool on AO3. Chapter 3 Hermits, A Brief History. Momo looked on at his friend after standing up from the table. His head was already falling back against the seat. Mumbo cleared the dishes before going to set up the bed. He fetched spare sheets and pillows and made it up while he worried over his friend. Grian had gone missing when they were only 7, young enough that for most people they probably have moved on or even forgotten about him by then. But they had grown up together under the threat of the Watchers. The safest way to live back then had been in quite small, tight-knit communities, often made up of only a few families. For all intents and purposes, Grian was his brother. He and his cousin had been Mumbo's only friends his own age. So when Grian and his mother had to flee for the safety of the rest of them, it had been a huge loss already. When they lost contact altogether, the whole community had mourned right up until they were destroyed. Mumbo and Grian's cousin, Jimmy, had only survived because the house collapsed on them, hiding them from view while the others drew the Watchers away. They had been found a few days later by Exuma. His eyes were the same unnerving shade of purple, but held an undeniable kindness to them. He brought them back to his own small community, which itself was made up of the remaining members of other destroyed groups. They never did find out what happened to their families, but based on the stories of others, it wasn't hard to guess. Zuma had been the one to propose they leave. The Watchers were getting more aggressive and more powerful by the day, and contact with anywhere outside their reach was starting to become unreliable. None of them really had any hold-ups about staying. Most of them had nothing left but the clothes on their back. On foot, it took them nearly a week to get to the nearest airport that was, to their limited knowledge, still operating. They got cheap seats, sitting in the cargo hold. It had been a long, cold, dark flight, but with so many people fleeing and pretty much everywhere else refusing to send planes in, the options were limited. All they were allowed to bring was what they could carry. It saved room for more people trying to get out. And among those lucky enough to escape, they were luckier still. One of their group, Cleo, had a contact in the States that she was able to get a hold of after they landed. He agreed to help all of them out, so a few hours later, they met one Joe Hills from Nashville, Tennessee, and the minibus he rented to get them all somewhere safe. Beyond that point, Mumbo couldn't honestly recall much of what happened. They were finally somewhere out of the Watcher's reach for the first time in his life, and he just lost nearly everything he'd ever known. He knew the other hermits jumped right into finding jobs and getting them a proper place to stay that wouldn't see them all packed in like sardines in Joe's parents' living room. Mumbo and Jimmy stayed there at Joe's most of the time for the first year, while the adults worked on sorting things out. Somewhere in the chaos, Zuma had taken on the role of legal guardian for Mumbo and Jimmy. The following fall, they were enrolled in the local middle school. By winter break, Zuma and the other hermits that had come over together, along with a few new friends they'd made, teamed up to buy an old rundown apartment building that had been scheduled for demolition. The structure itself was sound, it just needed a new roof and some major cleanup work. They moved in as soon as they got the roof redone and the lobby cleaned up. They slept there, again all together as they slowly cleaned up the rest of the building, room by room. Mumbo's apartment had actually been the first they did, as it had required the least amount of work. They put him and Jimmy there together to try and give them some sense of normalcy and security in the upheaval. Zuma had been the one to pick out the fold-out bed couch for the space. He slept there for years, while he and Jimmy grew up, even after he had an apartment of his own tidied up. Most of the hermits had fold-out couches, actually. After so long living in such close quarters, some of them found it hard to make the switch. The couch beds offered a good crash pad for any of them that may have needed it, or anyone else that may have come along. A lot of the hermit's friends moved in over time, growing their numbers and filling the once desolate old building with life. It helped they hadn't grown up afraid of drawing a watcher's eye. Their presence helped them all learn to live again, in a way. And those that had escaped the watchers taught the others how to become a family. The title of Hermits came from a co-worker of Scar explaining that he'd become a hermit ever since moving into his new apartment. The story had been shared around and the title was adopted with a sense of pride. And that's where they stayed. Jimmy had moved out after high school with a couple of friends he met. They were also escapees of the Watchers, Lizzie and Joel. The offer had been made for them to join them in the hermit apartments, but Jimmy had decided he wanted some space to explore on his own a while. He didn't move far, of course, but the change had been difficult. Mumbo had the apartment to himself ever since. He looked back over to see Grian fully asleep on the table. At least for now, he'd had someone to share with it a while once again. And that is the end of chapter 3.